Welcome to 2020-45. The date is May 1st, 2045, and today is the 200-year anniversary of the publishing of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. On today's show, we will dive into the ideas encompassed in his narrative and discuss the impact this novel had on all of history. Let's get started. To start off, we have an exclusive interview for you. We used our 2020-45 time machine to travel back in time to the year 1845 and sat down in an exclusive interview with Frederick Douglass himself to discuss his life as a slave and his purpose for writing his narrative. We interviewed Douglass shortly after the publication of his narrative, while he was taking refuge in England to avoid being recaptured by his slave owner in the United States. Let's take a look. So Frederick, can you tell us anything about your life as a slave?
I was born into slavery in Maryland, and for the first part of my life, I never knew my age nor birthday. I never knew who my father was. All I know is that he was a white man. I only saw my mother about 5 times in my life, as she was sold to another plantation early on. I worked on a southern plantation until I was about 7, and was sold up north to a family in Boston. That is where my mistress, Miss Old, began to teach me how to read, until she succumbed to the vile nature of slavery and was forced to stop. The beginning of my education opened my eyes to the terrible truth of my situation, and I spent the rest of my life as a slave, moving back and forth between different masters and yearning to escape. To begin to describe something as terrible as slavery is near impossible, but I understand the importance of this interview. Being born as a slave, throughout my whole life, there was a constant sense of fear that the whippings and other forms of torture would be inflicted on myself or my fellow slaves on the plantation. The unrelenting work we endured was taxing physically and mentally. There was no humanity in the treatment or supplies we received. As I said in my narrative, we were given meager portions of food and clothes, only to stay alive, to work, so that our masters could make a profit. The life of a slave was filled with pain, fear, and suffering, and to escape this was my goal.
Why did you decide to write this narrative?
I decided to write this narrative not only to recount my story as a slave, but to enlighten those who do not fully understand the sickening identity of the institution of slavery. I believe my fellow abolitionists are fighting for the right cause, but they do not know the true nature of what they are fighting for. I wanted to share my experiences to create a sense of urgency about resolving this issue. Many people know that slavery is an issue, but they don't know how deeply rooted it is in the Southern culture.
What do you hope this book does to change the American slave system?
To directly quote my narrative, I state, hoping that this little book may do something toward throwing the light on the American slave system and hastening the glad day of deliverance to the millions of my brethren in bonds, faithfully relying upon the power of truth, love, and justice for success in my humble efforts, and solemnly pledge myself anew to the sacred cause I subscribe myself.
This has been very insightful, Frederick. Thank you for sitting down with us today, and we wish you the best of luck for whatever comes next. The next place our 2020-45 time machine went was the year 2018 to talk with a historian from that time period and discuss the effect that Frederick Douglass's narrative had on history up until that point. So, how did Douglass convey his message in this narrative?
I think Douglass conveyed his message most effectively through his style of writing. He was very straightforward throughout his novel and objective when describing events. By doing this, he allows the audience to understand the severity of the situation without any fluff. He is very descriptive and often overwhelms the audience with imagery that is brutal and blunt, which evokes a sense of guilt in his audience who may not understand how dire the situation is. If Douglass was too vague and nonspecific about detail, his audience may have not taken it as seriously and overlooked what was happening without any sense of urgency.
What made his narrative so effective?
One of the most effective tools Douglass used in his narrative was metaphors. His primary audience was mostly abolitionists or Northerners who may have not known the full extent in the inner workings of slavery in the South. He compares what he felt to an experience his audience would be familiar with. For example, as Douglass was describing the feeling of being elected to do errands at the great house farm, he stated, A representative could not be prouder of his election to a seat in the American Congress than a slave on one of the farms should be of his election to do errands at the great house farm. This paints an example of how his use of metaphors creates a connection between him and his audience.
And what are your thoughts on this book?
Personally, I found the book very intriguing to get a different perspective. The book also allowed me to use events described and put it into context of what is happening today. His style of writing is very interesting to decipher, and his use of imagery allows me to fully understand the depth of the situation.
After interviewing with our historian from 2018, we decided to think about the relevance that Frederick Douglass's narrative had on the world up until that time. And we discovered that many of the main concepts Douglass encompassed in his novel were still applicable later in history. So we decided to travel back to 2045 and talk with a social science expert to learn more. So, what claims does Douglass make in his narrative?
Douglass has a few overarching themes that he develops throughout the novel. One of them happens to deal with religion, more specifically, how it can be used to justify horrific acts. He mentions that one of his owners would quote Bible verses while punishing his slaves, which seemed to be a commonality in the South. Douglass referred to religion in the South as the slave-holding religion, and he did not believe that the practices of religions in the southern United States were done out of dutiful devotion, but merely used as an excuse to justify their slaveholding. Another theme that Douglass mentioned in his narrative is that not only how horrific slavery was for the slaves, but also the effect it had on the slave owner. When Douglass moved to live with another family in Boston, he saw firsthand how slavery changed his mistress, Miss Auld, from a kind-hearted woman who had begun to teach him how to read into a cruel, callous slave owner. Douglass says that cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. His experience with Miss Auld demonstrates a theme developed in Douglass's novel that the inhumane act of slavery was damaging for all those involved, and representative of the immortality and cruel representation of human nature.
What societal problems were occurring in the early 2000s era?
In this time period, Douglass's claims took shape in different aspects of society. Looking back at the topic of religion, it became a new subject of discussion during the gay rights movement. People would argue against same-sex marriage, justifying their belief by quoting the Bible's lack of gay couples. To some extent, people would use their religion to discriminate against the basic human right of loving who you want. Once again, demographics showed this occurs primarily in the southern United States, as their religion was an integral part of their culture. And while loyalty to religion was not a negative practice, the controversy occurred over the question of whether it was done as an excuse to validate their discrimination. Furthermore, we once again saw the next of Douglass's claims about how slavery was harmful to both the slave and the owner in the form of police brutality in the 2000s. While there is still an obvious discrepancy between the cruelty of the effects it takes on each party, overall it takes a toll on both. It seems like every day there is a new case of an African American unjustly killed for no apparent reason. Police would use excuses to get out of any consequences and soon drop significantly in popularity within the public eye. It was easy to see how the cruel nature of discrimination that was enacted against discriminating against Americans such as Emmett Till, Eric Gardner, and Michael Brown, prompting such movements as the Black Lives Matter. And once again, it stems from holding too much power over someone, corrupting and affecting both parties involved. It shows how the issues described in Douglass's novel sadly still occurred in the 2000s as well.
And in what way do you think this book could have been influential in the year 2018?
If we look at some influential writers and activists of the early 2000s, we will once again see the same claims and strategy of conveying their message. First, we have Malala, who wrote a powerful book about her life and the obstacles she overcame as a woman in Pakistan who advocated for women's education. Then we have Tahalsi Coates, who similarly wrote about his own experiences dealing with racism in America. It's clear evidence that the idea of establishing empathy to influence an audience has continued from Douglass's own account of how, in his own words, this little book may do something toward throwing light on the American slave system. It was clearly successful in its purpose, citing two influential abolitionists of the time who introduced his book in the preface, and their praise of his ability to describe slavery in such a way the readers clearly understand the situation. They followed Douglass's initiative of showing the world as it is to people who don't understand what it's like to be a minority. To quote an article written in 2017 by Nathaniel Frank, "If you write one, often men make policy or rulings or otherwise hold power over others, you can't do your job well if you don't practice empathy. To appeal to empathy is not a plea for powerful men to feel sorry for minorities. It's about creating the moral habits of mind that involve putting yourself in others' shoes so you can better understand the many sides of an issue that disproportionately affects people who aren't you. Overall, the style of Douglas's narrative and his overarching claims have continued to influence activists for generations to follow.
We hope this program was as enlightening for our viewers as it was for us. Frederick Douglass's narrative may have been written 200 years ago, but his message is still prevalent across history. Thanks for tuning in to 2020 45.